Perspectives, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation podcast. Today, we're talking to Sheila Bird, host of THPO Talk, a podcast focusing on Indigenous preservation. Sheila describes her podcast as being about important issues in Indian country through the eyes and perspective of a tribal historic preservation officer, or THPO. Discussions on the podcast center around historic preservation and environmental laws, and other legislation impacting the Indigenous community and preservation. Sheila is a member of the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. She is a descendant of the Kituwa Nighthawks Paint Clan. She is a former THPO and is a tribal consultant with a background in the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA, and in tribal environmental issues. Thanks for joining us today, Sheila.
Thank you for having me to be here.
Now let's start kind of with a general one. Can you tell us a little more about your background, and in particular, how did you come to historic preservation as a career?
Well, I think anybody that comes into this role has a story. And the unique thing about those that come into preservation work related to the tribes is you're not going to find the same one. It is so uniquely identified because I think we sound like a broken record in our podcast because we emphasize on the fact that there's no such thing as a THPO school. And we also emphasize the fact that it's never really been a broad path created for those of us that have ended up in this work. On our podcast, on episode 1, the Women's Council, which is what we call my partners, Raylyn Butler for Creek Nation and Deanna Bird from Choctaw Nation, we both talk about how all of us came into this role, and they are all different. And for me, uniquely, when I went to college at the grand old age of 38, I raised my children first before I actually could leave my tribal community, which I moved 3 hours away to go to college. I went to study tribal sovereignty, and it wasn't to become a lawyer. It was basically to try to understand why our tribes were in the predicament that we were in, and to understand as an adult, I finally learned that we were a removed tribe, and it never made sense to me. It didn't make sense to me as a child. It didn't make sense to me as a young mother, and it certainly didn't make sense to me as an adult learner. But I felt better knowing how it happened. And then when I went back home after school, I began working for the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. But it was as a research analyst in their Attorney General's office for a program that they had there. And somehow that led for a path into beginning their Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And I completed an application for them to have their very first THPO office. And I'm the one that completed their application, the end part of it, and their agreement. And I had no idea what I was walking into, but I did know that the foundation of this office was understanding the law and understanding the sovereignty of the tribes. I'm glad that I went to school to gain that detailed understanding, because for Indian policies, it's very complicated. And, I tell people it's like a woven web of confusion. And to be able to untangle it takes quite a skill set to do it. And I'm not saying that I'm a master of it, but I do understand enough of it to pull away enough to define what applies to what I'm passionate about. And right now it's the preservation laws. And that it was that journey, me going to college, trying to understand why my community has been impacted by government policies, going back to my home community, working for the Cherokee Nation while I was still a member of the United Kituwa Band, starting their THPO office. Because I had no idea that job even existed. But once I got into this role and I started learning about it, I couldn't believe it. It was like a dream job. And I'm like, this would have been something that I would have prepared for. This would have been something that I would have wanted to do because it's meaningful. But man, it's been the most challenging. And, you know, Raylyn and her story really moved me too, because she talked about when she went to college and their activism against a project. And Deanna told me about her path. And when I say that every one of us had a different journey getting here, if we had a thesaurus of it, you know, we would all have different journeys getting here. But that was my path into this work. Even though I had to go to school to learn how to understand the infrastructure of these laws that surround our work, it was a lifetime of living in my tribal community that prepared me to be the best defender. And then I was able to support it by understanding the preservation laws that we use in the day-to-day work.
Well, it's such an interesting background. Picking up on one thing you mentioned, you said there's no THPO school. And I thought, you know, such a simple phrase, but such a powerful statement. And probably with everything that you've been through, you could, if there were a THPO school today, you'd probably be one of its deans. But, you know, but besides your interesting and distinguished background, you have another distinguishable characteristic. And I think it says you're the first guest on this podcast who also has your own podcast. Which listeners can see in your background and in the intro. So tell me a little bit about that. So first of all, why did you start your podcast?
Well, you know, when I did walk in the world of THPO world, I was told when I first came into this job, into this work actually, that it would take me a couple of years to get a really good grip of the full ratio of the knowledge base that it took to master the understanding. And there was no greater understatement. And it was true. So, you know, I worked for the Cherokee Nation for 2.5 years before I came out to become a consultant. And the reason why I came out to become a consultant is because we needed a bigger voice on both sides of the issue. And when I came out to work as a consultant, it was so that we could get our message across the board. And when I was working with an agency, well, it was actually a company, to help them develop a tribal protocol to help the tribes achieve something that we had been setting at the table. And man, we were pounding our fists on the table, demanding to be heard. And now I got to sit across the table and help a company develop such a policy. I just felt like there was too many tables to be doing that at, and that we could only be at one table at a time trying to get that message across. And that's when I thought, how could we do this on a larger scale? There's so many of us out here that are passionate about this work and are passionate about our sacred sites and our cultural footprint. How can we get a bigger voice out there? And I know that there are THPOs out there that are just as passionate as I am, but they can't leave their job. It was a hard choice for me. Man, I tangled with it for a long time to leave. And, you know, not that my voice, well, kind of made a difference, because when we lose one, we lose a lot. You know, out of the 574 tribes, there's a little over 200 of us that we know of that actually has the actual agreement. There's a lot more. But when we lose one, we do lose a lot. So to step out of that role as a THPO, I had to try to find a way to help us and help us to have a bigger voice. And the fact that, you know, I just felt like THPOs don't have a platform, and they're probably the most underrated jobs. And I just felt like to get a podcast, and it was at the time, because I've been doing this since 2000 and December of 2017. I did my first interview with somebody trying to figure out how to do it. And it's 2022, and we just now put our first episode on air. So December 2017, I interviewed Deanna Bird, who is now part of our women's council, in 2018. So it wasn't for lack of trying. I was trying to figure it out. But I'm a preservation officer. I'm not an engineer, so I couldn't figure out how to record. But I was buying all the software. I bought the microphones. I bought everything that I needed to get it done. I just couldn't master it. I mean, I'm a master of all trades, a lot of trades, actually. Ask anybody. But I couldn't figure out how to put this podcast together at the same quality that I felt like the message that we were trying to put out to the world deserved to have. And so I just felt like a podcast is a way that we could get our message out so broad, because it doesn't matter what landscape that you're on. And we talked about that on one of our episodes when we had the Florida Seminoles and we had the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate all on one episode talking about one policy issue. Because we're trying to bring a landscape together on this to show that it's not just one rogue group of tribes that have an issue, that some of these policies don't work for any of us. And that when these ideas came across the Congress or whoever was trying to promote the interests of the tribes, I'm not against some of these laws, but I think that, and I think that these preservation laws had us in mind. And because they don't work for us, today, I just feel like maybe they weren't talking to the right people. But today we are well advanced that we can use these technical tools to get our word out there and say, hey, we're here and we have something to say about it. And I just feel like for the THPOs, they're so busy. They don't have time to come out and do what I'm doing. And if I can just borrow their time, I'm borrowing their message right now to bring it forward. And I'm not a THPO anymore, but I was a THPO and I carry their message. But that's why it's THPO Talk. Talk about what they go through. We can talk about these policies that impact their everyday life. And we include THPOs as often as we can and as they are available.
Well, you've been doing this for long enough now. I have other friends that host podcasts, and they're amazed by the reach they have, by the far-flung places where they have downloads. That listener that you never would have imagined you were reaching emails you in the middle of the night and says you touched them somehow with something you're doing. So at this point in your work, you must have a sense for that experience, for the kind of reach you've had, or someone who's contacted you. And I'd be curious to know if you have a story that you could tell along those lines of something that surprised you, of someone who's tuned in to what you're doing.
Well, I know this last Monday, a week ago today, actually, I was a speaker. I was a keynote speaker for Indigenous Peoples Day. And last week, two things that had come to mind. And I was telling my husband, I said, I guess you really don't know when you share something with somebody, how long it stays with them or how it impacts them until they come back and maybe tell you one day. There was a young lady, she's from a Washington tribe, and she sent me a message from our website. And she is working as a tribal monitor right now. And she just wanted to thank me for what we're doing on THPO Talk. And she said, I've learned so much from your podcast. And she said, I feel like I need to learn more. And if there's more that I can learn, I'd like to reach out to you, which we've always made ourselves available. I've always made myself available to the tribes. But last Monday, when I was being introduced as the keynote speaker at an event, there's 2 times that 2 women had introduced me and had mentioned some things that I had done in the past that I had completely forgotten about. One of them was for Indian child welfare, and it was a few years back. And God's gonna make me cry. It made me cry then. But there was a movement for baby Veronica, and the Cherokee tribe was very involved in that case. And they were doing some things. And I make moccasins, and I had made a bunch of moccasins. And I had given those moccasins to them. And I had forgotten all about it. And we don't brag about those things. We don't talk about them. You just make them and you give them. And when she brought them up last Monday, it really touched my heart that 10 years after the fact, that this young lady that brought it up is now the president of a university. And when she was introducing me, she mentioned that, and that really moved me. And I guess that was probably one of the most recent moving stories that's been told. But it's not even about preservation, but it's just about caring. And I think it's just about caring about our people. It's about caring about our community. And I've always said in our podcast that, being a THPO, we wear emotions on our shoulder. And I do that broadly. People will tell you, I wear my emotions on my shoulder. You never have to guess what I'm thinking. You always know one way or the other. It could be good, could be bad. But so 2 spectrums there is the young lady that's a tribal monitor right now. If she hears, she'll know who she is. And then for the president of the college, she'll know who she is. But those things mean a lot to me when they come back to you. You don't expect them to, and you don't do that to expect it to. You just give it out of love. And if it comes back, then it just does.
Well, it sounds like I sure hope you're giving thought to writing your memoir someday, because you've got a lot of stories and life experiences. And while you were talking, it made me think too, if there's not a big THPO oral history project, there ought to be, because so many of your stories and experiences, are right here. They're right here. Those, I hope those are captured and passed on to the next generation, which leads me to my next question. We haven't talked a lot about preservation so far, actually, on a podcast that's about preservation. But we've gotten some of your background and kind of where THPO Talk fits in. And so I'd say, especially since the COVID era, there's been such a proliferation of podcasts and new forms of media. And so how would you say your podcast and these other forms of new media together help to advance historic preservation for Indian tribes?
For the tribes, we are able to come together now in this present day form by having an advanced reach into tribal communities, by educating each other without limitations. I think in the past, we were just isolated to our individual communities within our communities. And while each of our communities are sovereign and each of our tribes are unique in our languages and our identities, we all have common interests when it comes to protecting our cultural resources, our natural resources. We each have our cultural footprint that's spread out across North America. There's very few of us that are in our homeland. We're all removed tribes. We have a large footprint of removal. Some tribes are back on their homeland, but they were moved about. So I think we can share that information now. We have the data, we have the ability to learn about it. So I think with today's ability to network and to share this information. We're a little bit more advanced than we were back then. And I see that that's where we're going with technology, with our advancement. We're not what we used to be. I think our limitations are what we want them to be, and they don't have to be there at all, really.
Well, we have something else in common too. We have both on your podcast and on this podcast, we have had Ira Matt on as a guest, the ACHP director of the Office of Native Affairs. And so I'm curious to know whether that particular episode or some of the others that you've done, what would you say are some of the major topics that you've covered? And how do you think some of those episodes have been received by listeners?
First of all, we were really glad to have Ira Matt join us. And, he joined us right after he took his new role. He didn't have to, I know he had a big plate, like right when he took his new position. And I knew Valerie, I have, in my role as a THPO, I always made a point to reach out to the ACHP. And it wasn't through any of their trainings. I've never attended an ACHP training. I knew it was there, but I always made it personal. I always made time to call somebody. I always made time to reach out to them and ask individual questions. And I remember meeting Ira Matt whenever one of the tribes had the ACHP come to Oklahoma because there was an issue. And so the ACHP made themselves available to the meeting, and they came, and I was invited to come in as support for the tribe. So I went, and that's the first time that I met Ira Matt, and I remember him from that meeting. But I also remember calling the ACHP and talking to him on the phone. So I knew him vaguely. So, for the podcast, our intent here is not only to create awareness for everybody, not only just for the THPOs, not only to get the THPO message out there, not only to inform the tribal administrators of what our roles are, but also to network with the agencies, and particularly the ACHP, because they do govern historic preservation. They have a huge role and responsibility. So if you're in preservation, you're going to know who the ACHP is first and forefront. Because I remember when I first started learning about preservation work, it was their guidance that I referred to get my first learning experience. Working at the Cherokee Nation before I decided to go into that role, that's where I started studying about what a THPO responsibility was. And so I wanted to reach out to the ACHP. And at first I didn't know if they would come on to the podcast. I didn't know what the rules were. And as soon as, I reached out to Valerie. When I first reached out to Valerie, she was excited about it and she was going to come on. And then when I learned that she had retired, Ira agreed to come on, and we were real excited about that. He came on, and I'll tell you, that was a game changer. That was a game changer for, I think, for the tribes to hear what the ACHP's commitment is to the tribes. But it's something that I've known all along. I felt like I've known it all along because I relied on the ACHP for that commitment. And that's why I called upon them. And that was part of my message in that one of those episodes was some of the tribes don't even know their role, what their role is for, how to reach out to them, and that you can reach out to them. And even though there was only one or two people in that office, they are still there for the tribes. And I will tell you, every time that I went to Washington, D.C., I always stopped by their office. And that was just to say hi. I would always go by just to say hi. I just wanted them to know that I might not need anything from you today, but when I do, I want you to know who I am. I want you to know who my tribe is, because there may come a time that something really important, there may be a crisis in my tribe where I'm going to need you to come and hear me. And when you hear me, I want you to hear me in the most sincere way and know that we need your help. But also, that gave me the right trust in learning and knowing who they were, on that I could put my faith in the process, because it really is a trust responsibility between the tribes and the feds. And we've had that old cliche between the tribes and the feds. We grow up with that. And so creating those relationships and those partnerships with any agency is a win. But, learning about Ira and him being a tribal member and learning his background, I think is a win for both parties. And so we were really glad to have him that day, and learning back. And then he was a former THPO at that. So he can see things the same way that we do. And I just felt like for our tribes, our tribal THPOs out there that may seem lost, or just sometimes we just feel defeated. We're just overwhelmed. And, we have a lot of challenges out there. I just want them to know that, we have a resource up here, that when you don't back down sometimes when you have a challenge, that there really are ways, and there's some places that you can go. And we want the ACHP to be one of those options. And we were glad to bring Ira Matt to the table that day. And in regards to some of the bigger issues that we brought forward, which is always fun to talk about, is when the Corps of Engineers filed their federal register notice, and it included the Appendix C. It wasn't all about Appendix C, it's about civil works. But, if it includes Appendix C, then that's what's going to grab any THPO and SHPO, grab their attention, because by the time we saw the comments back from everybody, nobody likes it. But, we had Chip Smith as our guest on our third episode. Our Stronger Together episode is 2 hours and 45 minutes. It's our third episode on our podcast. And to this date, I was worried about it, to be honest. I said, oh my gosh, it's 2 hours and 45 minutes. Nobody's going to listen to it. But we didn't want to break it up either. I mean, it was just such a long meeting, but it was good. We didn't even know where to divide it. We didn't break it up. But to this date, it is the most listened to episode for 2 hours and 45 minutes. Because, we know the standard. It's like an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, whatever. But people listen to it all the time. It's so informative, though. There's lots of good stuff in there. But there's a lot of agree to disagree in there as well. And Chip Smith is my friend, and we became friends over Appendix C. And but I'm still leery over that letter that he talked about. ACHP sent in and said to make it a regulation. I'm like, okay, we'll just talk about that another time.
Usually at the end of each episode, I try to leave our audience with a kind of call to action of some kind. So tell us for a minute, for our audience, how can they learn more about you? How can they tune in to THPO Talk? How can they get involved? And how can they contact you with feedback?
Well, we have a website at THPOtalk.com, THPOtalk.com. It's really simple. On our website, we have a blog, and it's called Musings from an Old THPO Lady. I think that's what I called it. We put a few things up there when I have time. But you can also go to our episodes to listen to us. And we are on Spotify. We are on iTunes. You can message us from there. You can email me at Sheila Bird at THPOtalk.com. that's basically how you can get in touch with us. We have a Facebook page, THPO Talk at Indigenous Preservation. But that's what we do. I try to post as much as I can. After planning this meeting, which, what normally would take a year to plan, we've done in a matter of weeks. I'll be able to pull my head out of the ground and pay attention to some details. But other than that, we're doing what we do, and people ask, where do you get the energy? Well, I'm paying homage to my great grandfather, O.C. Hogshooter, who was the secretary of the Nighthawks. And, he left our community back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he went to Washington, D.C. He met with President Taft in 1910, trying to fight for efforts to preserve our ways in our communities. And he left a legacy for us to follow, and that's what I do. I owe that to him, and I owe that to my grandkids who will follow my journey. And that's what I said in my speech last week. I said, we're creating this cultural footprint, and I want my legacy to be this, and I want my grandchildren and those that come further behind to not guess what our goals were and our preservation efforts were. I know clearly where my great grandfather stood in his work. And I found back in the Obama administration, they had the Tribal Nations Conference. I found when I was up there searching in the National Archives, I found a front page of the Washington Post in 1910. And he had the headline said, "Indians here with a grievance." And it was a picture of my great grandfather, O.C. Hogshooter, along with the chief of the Nighthawks, Redbird Smith, and his son, John. And they were standing there with their Washington, D.C. delegate. And the story in the newspaper talked about the meeting with President Taft. And so that footprint that he left was clear, and it was evident of the fight. But whenever we went back to Washington, D.C. a few years back in 2018, my cousin Sharon was with me, and we went to Deb Halen's office, and that's before she was the secretary. And my cousin and I was in the halls of Congress, and I asked my cousin Sharon, I said, do you think, I said 108 years ago, I said that our great grandfather thought about us, that his great granddaughters would be here in Washington, D.C., still fighting the same fight. And I said, hopefully we'll do a good enough job where our grandchildren don't have to fight as hard. So that's what we're trying to do. And that's where we get our energy.
Well, that's a powerful motivator, and I think a perfect place to end our conversation today. But I just want to say thank you, Sheila Bird, for being our guest today. For our audience, be sure to follow the ACHP on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube to keep up with the latest in historic preservation news. I'm Luke Nichter. Thank you for joining us on Preservation Perspectives.
Thank you.